What I want to talk about is this book, Lenin's Moscow, which has just been reissued by Haymarket Press. It first appeared in English in 1971, which is a very long time ago. Look, I think there's probably a couple of people here who were born by 1971, but not many. It was a sorry? It was a very different world, and we had very different expectations. I'd just taken out a mortgage, and I confidently expected that the revolution would come before I had to pay it all off. I paid every bloody halfpenny. But anyhow, as I say, the book was first published in English in 1971. The original French was published in 1953. In the summer of 1953, a few months after the death of Stalin, but before anybody really knew what the implications of Stalin's death might be. And I think it's important to remember that the understanding of the Communist International was very different in those days, back in 1953. Basically, the Cold War was still at its height, and therefore you had really two schools of history of the Comintern, an anti-communist history and a Stalinist history, both of which agreed on one fundamental point, which was the basic continuity between Leninism and Stalinism. The anti-communists thought Lenin had prepared the way for Stalin. The Stalinists thought Lenin had prepared the way for Stalin. There was very little independent history. And such as there was, coming largely from the Trotskyist tradition, it tended to be very defensive. It tended to present a picture that really, while Lenin and Trotsky had been running things, everything was wonderful, and then all of a sudden everything was terrible when Stalin came to power, which at least has a certain truth to it, but actually things were somewhat more complicated than that. And this sort of attitude persisted, I think, up until at least the 70s. I remember in the International Socialists in 1969, we had a faction led by a man called Sean McGammon. And part of the platform of his faction was the first 4 congresses of the Communist International. Tony Cliff used to take great pleasure in asking McGammon's followers if they knew the dates of the first 4 congresses, which most of them didn't. You know, you had that, you had, as it were, that tradition of a very defensive history of the Comintern. Now things have changed enormously over the last 30 years or so. We now have, for example, Pierre Bruet's very fine history of the Communist International. I understand the English translation of this is now complete, and it should appear within the next couple of years. We have the very fine work done by John Riddell, who has now made available to us the complete minutes of the first 4 congresses, so that we know what went on at those congresses in some very considerable detail. And we're beginning to get biographies of figures from the Comintern other than Lenin, Stalin and Trotsky, of whom there are probably more biographies than anybody needs. Whereas you know, we have only a very few biographies of people like, say, Radek. There's now a very fine biography of Radek by Jean-François Fayet, which unfortunately isn't in English yet. We're still waiting, and I hope to see it before I die, but I'm very sceptical. We're still waiting for the first biography of Zinoviev, who played an absolutely central role in the Communist International, but nobody has ever written a proper biography of Zinoviev. Anyhow, all this is just a prelude to saying why I think this book by Rosmer is important. Because Rosmer was actually a participant. Rosmer attended the second, third and fourth congresses of the Communist International. He was on various leading bodies of the Communist International. He was on very friendly terms with both Lenin and Trotsky. And he produced this account, which is eminently not defensive. He doesn't. Rosmer didn't in any way abandon his original beliefs. He stood by his commitment to the basic aims and principles of the Communist International, but he had no illusions that it was infallible or that it hadn't made mistakes. On the contrary, he records all sorts of problems and difficulties from the period. And therefore I think he's given us a text, although, as I say, we now have works by Brouet, Riddell and so on, which complement it and make much more material available. I think nonetheless Rosmer provides an important introduction to the whole subject of the early years of the Comintern. Now, who was Rosmer? Alfred Rosmer was born in 1877. His family had left France and gone to live in the United States during the period of repression that followed the defeat of the Commune. So he spent the first 7 years of his life in the United States. So he was fluent in English as well as in French and in one or two other languages. Lenin is reputed to have said of him that he was a man who knew how to keep quiet in several languages. He first became politically involved in the period of the Dreyfus case, and then became involved with a journal called La Vie Ouvrière, Worker's Life, which was launched in 1909 by a man called Pierre Monat. Although it never had a massive circulation, it did have a very influential international circulation. It was a fortnightly journal that attempted to produce both commentary and analysis aimed at essentially the syndicalist milieu. So the tradition that Rosmer comes out of is the tradition of syndicalism. And I think it's important to be clear on the meaning of the word syndicalism, because it's one that is very often much misused on the left. People are denounced as syndicalists, when in fact they're not really syndicalists at all. And this is a bad habit which goes right back to Lenin himself. I've just been reading the biography of Shliapnikov, and Lenin made great play of denouncing Shliapnikov as a syndicalist. And it's quite clear that whatever Shliapnikov's deviations were, he wasn't a syndicalist. Basically, the syndicalists argued that there was no need for political parties. What that meant was that the trade union would play the role both of a trade union defending the basic day-to-day interests of workers, and the role of a political organisation which And indeed, there's a book by two syndicalists called Pouget and Pateau, who describe in some detail what a revolution would look like and the way in which the trade unions would simply take over the organisation of social life. Now, of course, there are great problems with the syndicalist position. One problem is, of course, if you have an organisation which is simultaneously a trade union and a political party, it actually will have a much more limited membership than a trade union. So that in France, the CGT, in the period just before 1914, had only 500,000 members, whereas in Britain and Germany you had 3 or 4 million trade unionists. So there were serious problems. At the same time, the syndicalists did do some very serious work, notably around the question of anti-militarism. And the important thing, as far as Rosmer is concerned, is that in 1914, he and Monat and a very small group of supporters of the Vie ouvrière were among almost the only people who opposed the war from the very first day, and fairly rapidly became involved in distributing anti-war literature illegally or semi-legally. And they very soon came into contact with a Russian exile in Paris called Leon Trotsky. I think it's important to remember that while Lenin was sitting in Switzerland reading Hegel, Trotsky was in Paris producing a daily anti-war paper, Naše Slovo. So this was the point at which Rosmer and Trotsky got to know each other. And probably through Trotsky's recommendation and the fact that La Vie ouvrière had been quite widely known in the international movement, in 1920, Rosmer was invited to Moscow to participate in the second Congress of the Communist International. This was before the founding of the French Communist Party. And again, I think it's important to remember the importance of the syndicalists in the founding of the French Communist Party. There's a common myth propagated by, particularly by people who advocate entrism into social democratic parties, that says that the communist parties, the mass parties of the Comintern, were formed from splits in the social democratic parties. It's true, but it's true with certain reservations. And it's true that in France, certainly, the revolutionary syndicalists, people like Rosmer's wife, Marguerite Thévenet, a woman who's been almost completely written out of history, played an important role in the early years of the French Communist Party. But of course, as the history was taken over, and as many of the syndicalists departed, either expelled, as Rosmer was to be in 1924, or voluntarily, as the syndicalists departed, the history was rewritten so that their role largely disappeared. It's only very recently that people have started doing work showing the significant role played by the syndicalists at this time. All this, I think, is relevant to the picture that Rosmer gives us of the Communist International. And I just want to look at one or two themes in the book and quote one or two passages. I want to begin with his account of his first meeting with Lenin, because I think in many ways this sets the tone of the book and explains how Rosmer perceived Lenin and Leninism. Very different from the stereotypes that you get from many of Lenin's friends or enemies. When he got to Moscow, he was invited to go and meet Lenin. Lenin made a point of meeting as many as possible of the delegates to the Congress. As we were talking about the Zimavaldian minority in the French Socialist Party, he said to me, "It's time for them to leave the party now to form the French Communist Party. They've waited too long out already." I replied that this was not the view of the leaders of the minority. Previously, they'd been sometimes impatient to leave the party en bloc, but the recent Strasbourg conference had been so favourable that they were now opposed to the idea of leaving. That is, they believed they could win the majority, as indeed they did do at Christmas 1920. They had hopes of becoming the majority quite soon. "If that's the case," he said, "I must have written something stupid in my theses. Ask for a copy of them at the Secretariat of the Communist International and send me the corrections you're proposing." And this is really not quite the picture of Lenin that one gets from many accounts. That Lenin was concerned not simply to lay down a line, but that he was constantly willing to learn. As Rosmer sums up, just because he knew a lot, he was able to fill out his knowledge when the opportunity arose, and also an unusual thing in a leader to recognise that he had quite simply been wrong. And again, I think that probably remains true of many political leaders. So this is the picture he gives us of Lenin, and this was the situation in the second, third, and fourth congresses of the International. That, in the perspective of Lenin, the important thing was to spread the revolution as quickly as possible. And therefore, it was necessary to build mass organisations, initially in Europe, but then elsewhere in the world. And to do this, of course, this meant bringing people together. Many accounts of Lenin, and it's true, a good part of Lenin's life was devoted to demarcating himself from other people, to denouncing other people for their errors. In this period, Lenin is concerned quite centrally with something rather different, with trying to pull people together, with trying to bring an organisation to a stage of broad unity, so that it could effectively intervene in the situation. Now, there are a number of aspects to this, of course. The situation is quite complicated because, we've just seen from that passage I quoted, the Communist International was concerned to organise splits, to break away from the reformism, the rotten chauvinism of the Social Democratic Second International. And at the same time, the early Communist International had a problem, which I think we on the left really don't face very much at all today, which was not the question of recruiting people, but the question of keeping people out of the organisation. Because actually, briefly, the Communist International was very popular, and all sorts of people who had been in the in the Social Democratic parties were quite willing to ride the storm and claim that they were communists. The two people that Rosmer talks about particularly in the French Communist Party were Marcel Cashin and Ludovic Oscar Rosmer. Marcel Cashin had been an ardent supporter of the war in 1914. 1915, he had gone to Italy to try and negotiate with Mussolini's faction of the Socialist Party to get them to support Italy coming in to the war on the French side. So his record was, well, I was going to say dubious. It's not even dubious. It's quite clear what side he'd been on. But in 1920, having seen the way things were going, Cashin supported the affiliation to the Communist International. Likewise, and Cashin remained a loyal Stalinist right through to his death at an advanced age in 1958. Rosmer, on the other hand, walked out after a couple of years, went back to the Socialist Party, and ended up as a minister in Marshal Pétain's pro-Nazi government in 1940. Now, the strategy adopted by the Comintern was to set up conditions, the so-called 21 conditions for basis of affiliation, in order to try and keep out opportunists and people who were not prepared to actually seriously build a revolutionary organisation. What's interesting is that Rosmer was very sceptical about this. He said the Russian communists had drawn up these conditions meticulously, intending thereby to anticipate criticism of the method they'd followed in establishing the Communist International. These draconian conditions would form such a formidable barrier that the opportunists would never be able to pass through it. They were soon to see that this was an illusion. Certainly they had a good knowledge of the labour movements in the European countries, and they knew the leaders, having encountered them at the congresses of the Second International. But what they didn't and couldn't know was the lengths to which these men would go with their skillful manoeuvres, for they'd received their training in the practices of parliamentary democracy. They could pull more tricks out of the bag than the suspicious Russians could ever imagine. The secretary of the French Communist Party, Rosmer, for example, was going to spend 2 years giving them a lesson in the art of evasion. Now, very closely linked to this was the question of the United Front, which became more and more important in the strategy of the Communist International from 1921 onwards. And of course this, as Rosmer analyses, this produced certain problems because many members of the newly founded communist parties had just gone through what was often a very vigorous process of splitting with their former allies in the social democratic parties. And having done that, they were being told to propose unity to these people they'd just split from. And as Rosmer notes, when the German Communist Party proposed the so-called open letter at the end of 1920, most of the members of the Communist Party found these tactics excellent, but some party militants, and even militants of the Communist International, were shocked. What? After splitting, after calling these men traitors to the proletariat, We should propose common action to them. They were no less shocked by the demands formulated in the open letter. There was not a word about the dictatorship of the proletariat. It was written in a moderate and reasonable tone, avoiding any propagandist type of exaggeration. In the face of the employers' offensive, the masses considered any news split as a crime. The communists had to come close to them, but how? By affirming the necessity for the dictatorship of the proletariat. But was it not the case that many workers remained in the social democratic parties just because they still put their trust in the old methods? So the only way to approach these non-communist masses was to start from their present sufferings and to support them in their short-term demands. So that's Rosmer's analysis of how the United Front should work. As he also describes, with reference to the French party, a lot of comrades didn't quite understand. And he describes a meeting of the French Communist Party in February 1922, when the question of the United Front was being discussed. There was in the party a left-wing tendency composed mainly of new recruits, which was sincerely attached and devoted to the Russian Revolution. It was this tendency which had enforced affiliation with the Communist International, and it was always ready to approve its decisions. But this time it did so without enthusiasm. Nonetheless, one of its members came to the rostrum to defend the tactic which, one after another, the federal secretaries were condemning or approving feebly. But he did it in such a way that his intervention was a catastrophe, pure and simple. He was the one who on this occasion launched an expression destined to become famous: plucking the chickens. He couldn't understand why the United Front was arousing such feelings, and he went on to explain that it was no more than a subtle manoeuvre which made it possible to strip the socialist parties and the reformist unions of their members, who would be taken one by one like the feathers from a chicken. As may be imagined, the chickens, thus warned, became excited, jeered and shouted, to the great joy of the gallery and the consternation of the frank plucker. But the other thing that I think is important, and which Rosmer pays particular attention to, is that the United Front was to extend not only to reformists, but also to the people who saw themselves as being to the left of the Communist International. And that would include anarchists, syndicalists, and various ultra-left currents. And Lenin, in particular, was very concerned that such currents should be drawn into the Communist International. The Communist International needed as many friends as it could get, and it needed to draw them in both from its right and from its left. And Rosmer records how this position was being argued increasingly within the Communist International in 1920. To a young Spanish comrade who, wanting to prove his communist orthodoxy, had proclaimed, "We are waging a pitiless struggle against the anarchists," Bukharin replied sharply, "What do you mean by fighting against the anarchists? Since October there have been some anarchists who have come over to the dictatorship of the proletariat. Others have come closer to us and are working in the Soviets and in the economic institutions. It's not a question of fighting them, but of discussing frankly and cordially, seeing if we can work together, and only abandoning the attempt if there is an irremovable obstacle." And he shows how this developed in the course of the Second Congress of the Comintern in particular. Sorry. A number of revolutionary syndicalists have been invited to the Congress, some of whom were opposed to the very idea of a revolutionary party, standing by the old syndicalist idea that the trade union was sufficient. And Rosmer describes how Lenin responded to this. Lenin is replying to Jack Tanner, a British trade unionist and a leading member of the shop stewards movement. Lenin replied to Jack Tanner saying, in effect, "Your conscious minority of the working class, this active minority which has to guide its action, well, that's the party, that's what we call the party. The working class is not homogeneous. Between the upper layer, the minority which has come to full consciousness, and the lowest category, which has no political notions at all, between these is the great mass of workers which we must be able to bring along with us and convince if we want to win. But for that, the minority must organise. It must create a firm organisation and impose discipline based on the principles of democratic centralism. Now there you have the party." So what Lenin is trying to do there is, as it were, play down the distinctions between the syndicalists and the Bolsheviks, to claim that the idea of the active minority, which the syndicalists had argued for, was not really very different from the Bolshevik idea of a revolutionary party. All this became particularly relevant in the work that Rosmer was given to do, and for which he stayed in Moscow between the second and third congresses, which was the forming of the Red International of Labour Unions. This was meant to be a counter to the dominant organisation of trade unions, the Amsterdam International. And Rosmer was given the job of organising a congress to set up a Red International of Labour Unions, which was not intended, as is often claimed, to split trade unions, but rather to provide a focus for revolutionary currents within the trade union movement in various countries, and where there were syndicalist unions that had broken from the Amsterdam International, to try and draw them into the organisation. And Rosmer, of course, was particularly well placed to do this because of his own roots in the syndicalist tradition. It's interesting, I think, that he was entrusted with this job. What, of course, became fairly clear was that not all the Bolsheviks were as sympathetic or as sensitive as Lenin was to this task, and he had particular friction with Zinoviev, who he was supposed to work with. Zinoviev and I had been charged with preparing, each of us separately, drafts on which the definitive text of the appeal for the definitive text of an appeal to the Amsterdam International. But our two drafts were so unlike each other in form and content that there was no solution but to adopt one or the other as a whole. I had tried to set out the grievances of workers in an overall scheme which could impress and convince by recalling the past activities of the Amsterdam leaders and stressing that this federation was in no way international. Chauvinism flourished in it to such an extent that the affiliated nations were still classified as allies or enemies, as they had been in wartime. But Zinoviev merely let fly a broadside of insults, often in pretty bad taste, against Messrs, scab leaders, etc. Only someone quite ignorant of the labour movement and of British workers could imagine for a single moment that an appeal of this sort could win us supporters or even sympathy and make easier the job of the revolutionary minorities. Zinoviev proposed that we try to combine the two texts, but it was impossible. The appeal reproduced his draft in every detail. I was very annoyed at having to put my signature to it. So again, one can see the problems and the friction. Zinoviev, Rosmer identified quite early on as being a particular problem. And I think this book gives us some sort of basis for assessing the Red International of Labour Unions, which most historians of the period have tended to dismiss in a fairly negative way. There is a very good history of the Red International of Labour Unions by Rainer Tostov, which again I understand is in process of translation into English, and I think that will be a matter of some interest when that does appear. More generally, I think the value of this book is that it helps to put into context the debates and so on. It's very easy to quote Lenin or to quote from the documents of the Communist International, although they were some sort of timeless works of scripture. And what Rosmer does is to show what the context was. Just conclude really with quoting a short passage about Lenin's State and Revolution. Once again, a work I'm sure everyone's familiar with, a work of great importance. What Rosmer draws out is what this actually meant when this first arrived in France in 1919. Some copies of a book by Lenin called State and Revolution had arrived in France early in 1919. It was an extraordinary book, and it had a strange destiny. Lenin, a Marxist and a Social Democrat, was treated as an outcast by the theoreticians of the socialist parties, which claimed to be Marxist. It isn't Marxism, they shrieked. It's a mixture of anarchism and Blanchism. One of them even found a witty turn of phrase and called it Blanchism with sauce tartare. On the other hand, for revolutionaries situated outside the mainstream of orthodox Marxism, for the syndicalists and anarchists, this Blanchism, sauce and all, was a pleasant revelation. They'd never heard such language from the Marxists they knew. They read and reread this interpretation of Marx, which was quite unfamiliar to them. So I'm just trying to illustrate a few points from this book. Some of you probably know it already, but if you don't, I would strongly recommend it, and not just because I'm the translator, and I don't actually get any royalties, so that's not why I'm here. I think it is a very useful book to help understand what was going on in the Communist International in its early years, to see the enormous strengths of the movement, but also some of the weaknesses, some of the problems, some of the internal friction and conflict. So I would heartily recommend the book. I'll stop there. This question about really about the Cold War, about American domination, and so on. Yes, I mean obviously, I came into politics in early '60s, and yes, of course that problem is there, and yes, I mean I I would accept Liebknecht's principle, the main enemy is at home, and since the British government was generally in the United States pocket, then opposing the American side is going to be your first priority. On the other hand, I think there are enormous dangers in saying, therefore, we refrain from any criticism of the situation in Russia, and that I think was also a weakness for communists in Britain, because when certain, criticism of the Soviet Union was sort of continually suppressed, until you get the explosion with the Khrushchev speech, Hungarian Revolution, and so on. And then, of course, because you haven't actually prepared in any way for dealing with situations like this, actually the communist movement suffered quite substantial losses. So I think there are real problems there. On the question of the various questions about Rosmer that Ben asked, Rosmer was expelled from the French Communist Party in 1924, basically over something very closely related to the United Front, for the line he took on the British Labour government, which the official Comintern line was simply to denounce it, and Rosmer was arguing for a more sensitive approach to it. He was involved for some years with the Trotskyist movement. He and his wife Marguerite helped to build the first Trotskyist grouping in France. Once again, there's only extracts from this in English. There is remarkable correspondence between both Alfred and Marguerite with Trotsky. We published some of this, but only a small part of it in Revolutionary History some years ago. And it's very interesting to see the way they handled Trotsky. They didn't sort of. It isn't. Oh yes, Mr. Trotsky, you are completely right. Marguerite Rosmer took no nonsense from Trotsky. She was a formidable woman. They broke with Trotsky basically over the question of Molinier. Trotsky had discovered this a common phenomenon on the revolutionary left. Discovered this bright young thing called Molinier, and thought he would deliver much more quickly than somebody older and more cautious like Rosmer. But Rosmer remained on friendly terms with Trotsky, and in fact was visiting him in Mexico just before the assassination. So he remained in North America throughout the war. He then returned to France. Oh, the other thing that one should mention is his other major book, the first volume of which was published in 1936, was his history of the opposition to the First World War, which deals in very great detail with the way in which the French labour movement capitulated, and then the first pro-Zimmerwald groups of opposition were developed. He never finished that book, or rather he did finish it, but the remaining part of it was left in his home in the outskirts of Paris. And it was confiscated and destroyed by the Gestapo during the German occupation. Also, Rosmer's home was used for the founding Congress of the Fourth International in 1938. few years ago I went out to the suburb where Rosmer lived to see if I could actually find the house, but there's been a lot of new building around there and there was no way I could trace it. It really ought to be one of those blue plaques, you know, the Fourth International was founded here. After the war, Rosmer carried on. He worked with a small publication called Polytechnic M, which was run by Monat and one or two other survivors from the old revolutionary syndicalist tradition. It's interesting to note that it was Rosmer, and not the French section of the Fourth International, who was given the job by Natalia Trotsky of getting Trotsky's writings published in France, which was not easy because you know, earlier editions had largely disappeared under the Nazi occupation, and given the influence of the Communist Party, it was quite difficult to find publishers who were interested. Rosmer put a lot of work into that. In 1960, when he was aged 83, he signed the Manifesto of the 121, which was a statement by prominent intellectuals and others supporting people who refused to fight in Algeria and supporting people who actually gave physical assistance to the FLN. So that's a brief sketch of Rosmer's life. The question of the Red International of Labour Unions. Yes, I mean there were a lot of problems with the Red International of Labour Unions. The defining exactly what its role was, and of course there were tensions, and there was enormous triumphalism. If you read John Riddell's minutes of the third Congress of the Comintern, you know, there are people there saying things like, you know, the Amsterdam International is disintegrating and the Red International of Labour Unions will take over within months and so on, which was nonsense. The Red International of Labour Unions never acquired anything like the size that the Amsterdam International had. So there were real problems. And after the mid-20s, although it continued to exist, it played a very much smaller role in actually organising anything. One of the things it did do was to set up an organisation, the name of which now escapes me, but which was concerned with African and Afro-Caribbean workers. There's a book by Hakeem Rd which describes this in some detail. And this was, I think, because they didn't take it all that seriously, delegated out through the Red International of Labour Unions. As I say, Rainer Tostorff's book on the Red International of Labour Unions is extremely valuable. Of course, yes. You can read it, of course, yes. We'll translate it for us, although I think it has been, it is being translated. I did a review of it, a quite extensive review of it in Historical Materialism a few years ago, which I'm quite happy to pass on copies of to if anybody's interested. The question of whether Shliapnikov was a syndicalist. Shliapnikov had been in France and had been certainly had a positive view of the French syndicalists. On the other hand, from reading Barbara Allen's book, and you know, I haven't studied Shliapnikov in the original, but it does appear that he always recognised the importance of the role of the party. So to call him a syndicalist, I think it's the sort of thing that happens in faction fights, unfortunately. The question of the KAPD, I don't think Rosmer had any very direct links with the KAPD, but I think he had a certain sympathy for them. He records his meeting with Paul Levy, and Levy has been quite highly praised in some quarters. Rosmer, interestingly, had a very low view of Levy. His origins and way of life seemed incompatible with being the leader of the Revolutionary Workers' Party. Clarence Etkin had been optimistic and full of drive, but he was gloomy and fretful. His main aversion was the communists, who had opposed him at Heidelberg. He was obsessed with them, and the conflict took on the appearance of a personal quarrel. In his eyes, the syndicalists were not politically reliable comrades, and there was the danger they would be attracted by the anti-parliamentarism of the KAPD. We tried to get him to talk of other things, for the conversation was becoming wearisome, but it was impossible. He always came back to the terrible opposition. It was almost like a persecution mania. Traitors. Yeah, I tend to agree with what the comrades said. There will be traitors. You can't always predict. I've known one or two traitors in my time. I have to. I knew Christopher Hitchens vaguely. I have to say I never liked him. But on the other hand, an awful lot of other people I didn't particularly like, who remained good comrades for many, many years. So, I don't think, unfortunately, there's any way of predicting. Rosmer does describe meeting a very young man in Moscow called Dochio. He certainly had no indication of how this man was going to develop. And of course, Dochio did some very creditable things in the 1920s in terms of opposing the Rif War and so on. He ended up as a pro-Nazi fighting on the Russian front. Now, how one explains things like that, there are several people who appear in the narrative who ended up on the wrong side. But as you say, you can't predict them, and if you try and keep out anybody who might be a traitor, you lose far more people. The United Front problems, yes, indeed. The United Front is not an easy thing. It's not that sort of, oh yes, that's the United Front, we've got rules 1, 2, 3. The United Front can be extremely complicated and difficult, and exactly how many concessions do you make, how much criticism do you withdraw. So I think one just has to say the United Front is very difficult. That looking at previous attempts to apply it and its success and its failure may be of use, but there are no recipes. I would tend to agree with the general spirit of what people have been arguing, that the United Front is a complex question, and that of course it is constantly varying in different in different situations. So to try and read off how one should develop a United Front, question of small groups. In the period Rosmer's talking about, you are talking about mass organisations, and mass organisations often were, at least in verbal terms, revolutionary. We don't have that question nowadays. Whether small groups should get together on particular points or not is, it seems to me, a purely tactical question that, but invoking the concept of the United Front probably isn't very helpful. On the question of the Third World, there's not a lot in Rosmer, but there are a couple of things. Rosmer was at the Baku Congress in September 1920, which, if you read the proceedings of it, was actually in many ways very interesting. A large number of Muslim delegates, and really some quite vigorous discussion. Zinoviev, as usual, went a bit far, making one speech calling for a holy war. But there was some serious discussion at Baku. There's a remarkable speech by a Turkish woman talking about the issues that need to be raised, and the problems that are posed by the lack of support by Muslim men. Unfortunately, although Rosmer gives quite a vivid account of Baku, he doesn't really go into the arguments there. He also discusses quite briefly the conflict between Lenin and M. Roy over the national question. But other than that, I don't think there's anything very much in Rosmer, unfortunately, that will illuminate the very real problems that comrades have been talking about. It's probably true that the United Front was never successfully applied. I think there was the possibility at the time of the open letter at the beginning of 1921, which was completely screwed up by the March action. I think if we could write an alternative history of what would have happened if the March action had never occurred, it could be quite interesting. But I think the March action created enormous problems that were not simply wished away. Just two or three remarks here, really. The thing about the French Communist Party won the majority of the Congress at Tours, Christmas 1920. But I think it's quite right to say they never won the majority of the working class. Certainly electorally, I think, although the Communist Party did briefly have a good base, and they did do some very fine agitational work, notably in the Ruhr in 1923. They also managed to lose quite a lot of their new members very rapidly, even before the sort of systematic expulsion of dissidents like Rosmer and Souverin and so on in 1924. So yes, I think that's right. I only know this sort of anecdotically, but my recollection is that the German Social Democrats were just as stupidly sectarian and bloody-minded as the KPD. And the KPD could indeed claim, well, we tried, we offered them a united front, but they rejected it. And you end up with a chicken and egg situation, because of course if you go to people and say, well, you're a fascist organisation, but we'd like to unite with you from below, they're apt not to take it terribly kindly, It's very difficult to establish the blame. The other point that I thought was very useful, something somebody made, was this question about what we have in terms of the documentation. And it is certainly true of Trotsky, and it is true of a whole number of other people inside and outside the labour movement. You know, that we have collected works of important people that are full of denunciations, but you never see who they're actually denouncing. And you know, unless you actually work very hard and go to libraries and dig out very obscure publications, you don't know. So, you know, I mean, the Trotskyist movement, I think, has been quite bad on this. It has, you know, that people are denounced for having certain deviations, when actually it's very hard. I remember some of my comrades being denounced in the early 70s as Abenites, you know, and I think very few of us had any notion of what Martin Abern had actually done or said, you know, that this was a bad thing, Abenites. You know, the question about translation, I mean, I'm sure Ben will support me on this. Translation is very hard work, you know, and therefore those of us who have tried to make a contribution, you know, there's an awful lot of stuff out there, and it takes a lot of time and energy to translate it. I know on the Trotsky question, Revolutionary History did an issue a few years back in which we tried to produce some of the texts that Trotsky had polemicized against. That was only scratching the surface. There's an awful lot more out there. Of course, with the greater availability of stuff on the internet as well, it is a bit easier to chase up this stuff. But and of course, you can get these mechanical machine translations, which are not terribly good generally, but they're probably better than nothing. So I mean, slowly we are beginning to piece our history together, but there's an awful lot of work to be done. So, you know, all young comrades should actually go away and learn 2 or 3 languages and then do some translation work. Okay, that's all I have to say. Except, you know, if you haven't got this book, when Haymarket managed to ship them over, I was hoping Haymarket would have some books here today. But, you know,
they're planning on coming tomorrow.
Sorry?
I think they're planning on coming tomorrow.
All right. Oh, well, if he brings any books, you know, as I say, I'm not, you know, I don't get royalties. So I just think it's a good book.